I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
It's New York City. It's okay. March 7th.
Well, partly it's taken to these very strange images that are behind your head right now. These are pictures of equations. I've been, for the last 15 years, trying to answer the kinds of questions that my colleagues have been raising. And what I've come to understand is that there are these incredible pictures that contain all the information of a set of equations that are related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that, because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web.
You're saying your attempt to understand the fundamental operations of nature leads you to a set of equations that are indistinguishable from the equations that drive search engines and browsers on our computers.
That is correct. So
wait, I have to just be silent for a minute here. So you're saying as you dig deeper, you find computer code writ in the fabric of the cosmos?
Into the equations that we want to use to describe the cosmos, yes.
Computer code?
Computer code, strings of bits of ones and zeros.
It's not just sort of resembles computer code. You're saying it is computer code.
It's not even just is computer code. It's a special kind of computer code that was invented by a scientist named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. That's what we find very, very deeply inside the equations that occur in string theory and in general in systems that we could say are supersymmetric.
That I'm willing to talk about it. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed.
This is the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Right now, we're inside a computer program?
Is it really so hard to believe?
Permission to speak freely, sir.
I welcome it.
Do you? Okay, then. Are you out of your fucking mind?
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
It's the non-physical, is what he was talking about. Now, next came Nick Bostrom, and he had his PhD from this very institution, from London School of Economics. He's now at Oxford. He was at Princeton, I believe, and he's another physicist. He's a physicist and a philosopher, has degrees in both. He wrote a paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And he just went through it logically, and he found that it was impossible to say that it was impossible. Then he found out that it was unlikely to say that it was unlikely. That left him with the conclusion that certainly almost all of us are living in a simulation. He said it was very likely. I mean, now in his mind, the simulation is done from some other physical thing that's outside of what's physical. So he wouldn't say that it's non-physical, but that's where it lands. It's beyond, it's some other physical place besides ours. That's how physicists say non-physical without using that word. So that was his conclusion.
That consciousness may indeed survive.
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain, and there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads, and that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes, and therefore we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now again, this everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you have to take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if in fact we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore all religions could be true in this simulated universe, and we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect.
This is an argument that tries to show that at least one of three propositions is true, although it doesn't tell us which of these three. The three propositions in question is first, that almost all civilizations at our stage of technological development go extinct before they reach technological maturity. So that's the first possibility. A second possibility is that there is a very strong convergence among all technologically mature civilizations, in that they all lose interest in creating ancestor simulations, as I call them. These would be very detailed computer simulations of people like their historical forebears, detailed enough that the simulated people in these simulations would be conscious. So the second possibility is that they just lose interest in doing this. And the third possibility is that we are almost certainly living in a simulation. So there's this argument that shows that one of these three is true. And the full argument involves some probability theory, but the basic idea can be grasped quite simply, which is that suppose it were the case that the first possibility did not obtain. So then some non-trivial fraction of civilizations at our stage eventually reach technological maturity. Then suppose the second possibility also does not obtain. So some non-negligible fraction of those mature civilizations are still interested in using the resources to running ancestor simulations. You can then show that because each mature civilization that devoted some resources to this purpose could run astronomical numbers of ancestor simulations, you can show that if the first two possibilities do not obtain, then there will be many, many more simulated people like us than there will be non-simulated people like us. In other words, almost all people with our kinds of experiences would be living inside simulations rather than outside them, if the first two possibilities are false. And conditional on that, we should therefore think we are probably one of the typical simulated people rather than one of the exceptional non-simulated people. So the structure of the argument then is that if you reject the first two hypotheses, then the third one follows, which then means you can coherently reject all three. That's the structure of the simulation argument. There's a further possibility that if you have a simulated civilization, that simulated civilization might, inside the simulation, develop the technology to run its own simulations. And you might then have a kind of nested simulation. With simulation inside the simulation, you might have many levels of simulation. But that's an optional extra. The basic simulation argument doesn't presuppose that. It's just that if you extrapolate the kind of computing power that an advanced civilization will eventually have, and you figure if they would use some of that immense computing power to running simulations, they could run an astronomical number of them. So therefore, in that scenario, most people with our kinds of experiences would be among the simulated people, because for each original history there would then be maybe millions or billions of simulated histories.